Good afternoon.
Thanks for doing this, Congressman Correa. Excited to have a conversation about federal cannabis policy. I am Paul Demko, the cannabis editor at Politico, and thanks everyone for joining us. Before we get going, I just encourage folks to submit questions in the Q&A column on the chat. We are going to open this up to your questions once we get going a little while. So please do that. We look forward to hearing from you. So Congressman Correa, today you introduced the Medical Cannabis Research Act. I guess could we start with you just telling us a little bit about that bill and why it's necessary?
Well, it's Paul, thank you. Great question. I know we only have a few minutes, but my work in this area, as I mentioned, has started about 15 years ago when I was in my district having town halls as chair of the Veterans Affairs Committee in the California legislature. And the one theme that kept coming up over and over again from veterans, they would come up to me and whisper in my ear, when can I get my cannabis from the VA? If I go to the VA and get my cannabis, am I going to be ineligible for other VA benefits? Am I violating federal law? Am I, and why and how? And set me on a quest to figure out how to legalize cannabis for medical use for our veterans. And then we found out that the VA had done no research at all on the medicinal benefits, purposes. What is cannabis good for when it comes to veterans? What is it not good for? And the VA, when we started proposing laws in this area to compel them to do the work, they would shoot back and say, oh, we can do it already. Be patient. We got it under control. And of course, we know that that wasn't the case. The case is the VA, they did some good work. They've done some great work. But when it came to cannabis, the Veterans Administration, VA, was not interested in going in this route. So we had to compel them. We had to force them. And of course, we got a lot of pushback. 4 years later, 5 years later, we're about to again introduce this legislation that simply says the following. You, the VA, has to research how cannabis affects our veterans in a number of clinical trials with different levels of cannabis strength. We want to find out what it's good for and what it is not good for. And I start out from the presumption that the vast majority of veterans are using cannabis for a number of things, PTSD and other ailments. And so that being the case, tie goes to the runner. Tie, essentially, presumption is on the veteran side. We want to see what we can do in that area of cannabis research in the VA.
Okay. Now, this bill, you introduced a very similar proposal in the last Congress. I believe it had more than 100 co-sponsors on both sides of the aisle, so widespread bipartisan support, but it was obviously not enacted. I guess why didn't that get across the finish line last time, and how do you see its prospects in this Congress?
Let me say, first of all, that this is not a Democratic or Republican issue. This is an issue of health care. But we've had 70 years of stigma surrounding cannabis. We've had 70 years of misinformation, policy driven by politics and not medical research. So you ask what happened. What happened is people are still today in the legislature very hesitant about working in the area of cannabis. Even our president has some concerns, but when you look at the voter movements across the country, state by state is legalizing cannabis, whether for medical or recreational purposes. We are beyond the tipping point. We have our bill and essentially the similar bill being moved right now by two senators, a Republican and a Democrat, Tester and Sullivan, in the Senate, along with Lou and Pete Mayer from Michigan. We have two bills that are going to move through the legislature, and hopefully we can get them together legally and push a single bill to the president's desk for signature. What has happened? People are recognizing that if we don't do it, the people of the United States will do it for us.
Okay. And I should also note that there was another bill introduced today, a very similar bill by two Republican members of the House, Miller Meeks and what's the other, and Mace. So yet another indication that there is, sort of strong support across the aisle. What about, you mentioned the Biden administration. We've obviously got a new head of the Veterans Administration, Dennis McDonough. What do you know about his views on this issue, and have you had any discussions with the VA about this since the change in administration?
I've not had any discussions with the new head of the VA in this area. And that is not the controlling factor. The controlling factor here is Congress moving a bill to the president's desk for a signature. The SAFE Act that just passed a few days ago in Congress had a vast majority of the votes. And I'm proud to say I helped Mr. Perlmutter from Colorado lobby the bill, move it through the legislature. And when we were looking up on the board, we discovered something wonderful. It had Republican no votes, but it had more Republican yes votes than no votes, and the vast majority of Democrats as well. Again, this is a movement whose time has come. We will sit down and educate the Veterans VA, the Veterans Administration on this issue, as well as the Biden administration. This is time to legislate on medical facts, on the facts as they are, and move forward.
What about the role of veterans advocacy groups on this issue? I guess, is there a spectrum of how comfortable they are in addressing the issue of marijuana, given some of the taboos that you've mentioned? And how have you seen that evolve in terms of where the veterans advocacy groups are on this issue?
The veterans are the reason. The veterans are the reason I am involved in this area of the law. They're the ones that compelled me to work on California legislative solutions to cannabis. They're the ones that said, Lou, we want you to continue your work in Washington. And I imagine if you look at Democrats and Republicans in Washington today, the veterans across the country have the same message. We want cannabis. We don't want other kinds of medicines. We want cannabis. This is what works for us. And we want access to it. We want the VA to give us prescriptions. We want the VA to provide it to us. And we want research. The veterans are driving this train. And if anything, I believe that as Americans, why would you argue with somebody who's a patriot, who goes off and fights wars in a foreign land, who comes back and can't quite readjust after seeing God knows what these veterans see in the battlefield, things that no human should see, and this is what they want to readjust. I'm not the guy to tell them yes or no. I'm the guy that says, give me the orders, I'm going to block for you, and I'm going to bring you solutions that you want. Paul, veterans are in the driver's seat. Let them drive this train.
Okay. You mentioned the Safe Banking Act, and I think probably most people know what that is, but basically that would allow banks to do business with cannabis companies without fear of federal punishment. And as you mentioned, that passed the House with overwhelming support, including a majority of Republicans. But that also happened in 2019 with almost the same level of support. I guess, how are you thinking about the prospects for actually getting that bill finished in this Congress, and particularly you got to go through the Senate at some point?
Education. Safe Banking Act. Canada's legalized cannabis. South American countries are legalizing cannabis. Israel is doing a lot of medical research in this area. Why in God's name are we sticking our head in the sand and not recognizing what's going on around us? Mexico will soon legalize cannabis as well. To think of employees in my district, cannabis shops, cash, people walking in with $300 to $500, my age, retirees, buying their cannabis, cash, and then somebody from the cannabis shop having to deliver that. They can't bank it, so they've got to pay their employees cash. They have to pay, this is the irony, they've got to pay their federal taxes because they're supposed to pay federal taxes with cash because federal law says you can't pay me with a credit card and you can't pay me with a check. It is my hope that we continue to educate folks in the legislature to figure out what's common sense. And driving around town with thousands of dollars cash in your glove compartment is just not common sense. It is a recipe for failure. Let's figure this out.
Okay. What about, though, there's also a lot of proposals out there to more fundamentally overhaul federal cannabis policies, and particularly, potentially remove it from the Controlled Substances Act altogether.
More, yes.
And, one of the interesting developments recently has been, the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, really championing this issue, a big change from, the former Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell. How are you thinking about the prospects for that and getting something even more, comprehensive done in this Congress?
Well, again, let's focus on the facts. Class 1, cannabis under that classification has no medical properties whatsoever. Even heroin has more medical properties than cannabis based on this classification. Absolutely ludicrous. I'll tell you a story about 15 years ago when I was working on cannabis here in California, introduced one of my first bills. I got a phone call from a doctor, Dr. Monahan, in Central California, Republican area, Republican emergency room doc. He said, I want to come and talk to you about your bill. I told him, I said, you don't live in my district, but you know what? You're a doc. I want to hear what you have to say. And I prepared myself mentally for a verbal sparring with this Republican conservative doctor. When he walked into my office, he said, Lou, he says, my daughter, 10 years old, epilepsy seizures since she was born. The only thing that stops the seizures is cannabis. And he says, my one ask of you is that your legislation have provisions to clearly label the strength and the properties of that cannabis product, because I want to cure my daughter. I don't want to get her high. So I want THC, CBD labeling to be proper and accurate so that I can continue to medicate my daughter. If you would have heard his statements, I took him with me to Sacramento. He testified for me as an expert witness. This is a doctor testifying. Is it going to make a difference a year or two? Every year we get closer to scoring. Every year that more medical scientific research comes to the forefront, we look at bigger gains. One of these bills has to get through. And my Republican colleagues understand, my Democratic colleagues understand, we have to make decisions based on scientific research, based on the facts, not on antiquated political war on drugs, on facts that never existed. And is the MORE Act going to make it? Is the Safe Banking Act going to make it? Is the Lou Correa VA bill going to make it? Well, we're going to punch hard because that's what the American people want us to do. Do something based on the facts.
Okay. We are going to go to audience questions shortly. So again, I'd remind folks, if you have questions that you want to put to the congressman, put those in now, and we'll pivot to that shortly. But one other question I had is, you have a somewhat unusual political. You are a member of the Blue Dog Coalition, which is the more moderate or even conservative Democrats, and yet you've been a champion of federal marijuana reform. I think that's a somewhat unusual pairing there. I guess why, what do you think about that? And what do you say to sort of your fellow, what argument do you make to your fellow moderates, your fellow blue dogs about this issue to try to convince them that, that marijuana legalization is the right path to go?
Great question, and the answer is obvious. Blue dogs stand for two things: national defense and tax policy, fiscal policy. And cannabis fits into that picture, which is a conservative, we're for small government. As a conservative, we're for getting government out of places where it should not be. And creating medical policy is not something that should be prohibited by the federal government. We should move ahead and do research and come up with solutions. Cannabis also is one of those products that, if you think about it, if you truly maximize its benefit to our society, it's also a product that should be taxed. It is taxed right now, but because it's a cash business, it's very difficult to assess the amount of tax revenue you can get out of cannabis. It makes sense. Make it legal, make sure it goes through the proper channels, make sure when those little senior citizens go into the cannabis shop, they can use their credit card, they can use a check, so that we can better account for every revenue piece in the cannabis industry. This makes total sense. If you're a libertarian, you know that government should not be in this realm of government, which is mandating something to be legal when we know it shouldn't be.
Okay. It looks like you touched on taxes, so I think we'll go there, because it looks like a number of questions from audience members. I'm sure you're familiar with Section 280E of the tax code, which essentially treats marijuana companies like drug dealers and says they can't take any of the standard deductions that companies take for employee salaries and benefits, and they end up paying, really, really high tax rates. You see an appetite to address that issue in Congress?
I think a lot of us are advocating for 280E, for that to apply to the cannabis industry. See that avenue. I think, though, the first thing we need to do is just declassify cannabis. We got to get there, and 280E will fall into place. I get it. It's painful because you are business folks. You do pay a lot of expenses, and not to deduct them just doesn't make sense. But again, all of this is based on the fact that we are not coming up with cannabis policy that is based on facts. It's all political. And I would ask anybody here that's listening, whether you're a medical professional, whether you're a consumer, whether you're a businessman related in this area, continue to advocate strongly. A few years ago, I remember we got in the middle of a fight in Congress because our Canadian trading partners were in trouble in terms of being banned from ever entering the United States if they sold any cultivating equipment to the U.S. intended to be used for cannabis. They would be essentially aiding and abetting in the cannabis industry, crossing federal lines with products that you're not supposed to, they're essentially illegal in the federal framework. And those folks were looking at lifetime ban from ever entering the United States for selling tractors and other products in the Midwest to cultivate cannabis. Again, the implications of Schedule 1 are beyond belief. It is ridiculous. Solution: strong advocates. I've got colleagues that I talked to just a few days ago, and I asked them for support of my bill, our legislation, and they said, "Lou, we didn't support it last time. This time we're going to support it simply because my state of X and X is just passed, just legislated, just passed a reform to legalize cannabis. So now it's legal in my state. Now I got to support you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting developments was from November was you had states like South Dakota and Montana, that are very conservative, where voters passed recreational referendums, which I think, surprised some people, and we'll see whether that does cause an evolution among some of the Republicans who represent those states on these issues. We've got a question here about the Biden administration. They've got a lot on their plate, as you may have noticed, with the pandemic and economic recovery and lots of other stuff. But how do you get the members of this new administration to focus on cannabis, particularly medical cannabis, given that 36 states now have programs that are in conflict with federal law?
Well, and a great question. And I said a minute ago, be strong lobbyists at the local level. If we can pass this legislation and get it to the president's desk, I think he's going to be hard pressed to make an argument that he's not going to sign this legislation. Why would you not? This would be a major, major shock to me if this legislation was vetoed by Biden. I cannot see a scenario where he would do that. I know he has personal issues with cannabis. A lot of people do. But through education, you change your position on these issues. I remember town hall I went to in my district a few years back, and I was there with a police officer, and we were all talking about cannabis, legalization, the new shops, and this older Latino lady puts her arm up and in broken Spanish said, "I have terminal cancer. My doctor told me the only thing that can help you now is cannabis. He gave me a prescription," and she said, "I'll be hell no will I ever use marijuana." She said, I'm an American citizen. I'm not a drug addict and I'm not a marijuana. I will never take cannabis and I don't care what my doctor says.
Mm-hmm.
This is an example of flipping that mentality in this country based on facts, not on political rhetoric.
Okay. What about, we got a question, another audience question here that has to do with the pharmaceutical industry. As you may be aware, they spend a heck of a lot of money trying to influence policy in Washington, particularly pharma, but also other groups as well and companies. And I think are quite successful in influencing policy. Are they a deterrent to getting medical marijuana legislation passed in Congress?
I haven't seen them be a deterrent to legislation in this area. I think, on the contrary, they're looking to get into this space in terms of opportunities. It's not only them, it's a lot of bigger players that are now coming in from other countries where cannabis is legal that are starting to position themselves financially in the United States to make sure that they're part of the market share that's coming. And my response as a policymaker is keep the entrepreneurial aspect of cannabis, okay? Continue to make sure that every resident, every taxpayer, every person who lives in the United States or in California has the ability to cultivate a number of plants at home. You want to make sure that it's very entrepreneurial, very much accessible to the average citizen. I've gone to some of my good friends from high school. They say, come over to my house. Let me show you what I got back. I've got 6 big adult plants. And this is what we do for the winter. This is our winter cultivation. And I laugh because, 40 years ago growing up, I'd never thought I'd see this day when you walk into a backyard and somebody's legally cultivating cannabis. And this is what you do to keep the market forces. This is what you do to keep competition in the cannabis field.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about physician education and how important doctors can be in this discussion, but I think you often see that they are very skeptical. A lot of doctors are very skeptical of medical marijuana and its efficacy. I guess, do you have any thoughts about how we change that culture and how you bring more physicians on board with this?
You know, I have to say that we have a challenge because doctors have federal licenses. Doctors have federal licenses, and they're in that gray area as well. In California, you can't prescribe; you have to recommend cannabis to your patients. And so, if you're a doctor, like my wife's a doctor, spent a couple of decades becoming a doctor, a lot of hard work. And just like the VA, if you've got to go out on the limb here, why? And there's a lot of skepticism. The discussion, the debate on drugs and the drug war is an ongoing one. I personally think this issue is a medical one. And I go out and I talk to medical groups and I say to them, it's time we move from treating drug addiction as a criminal issue. We have to treat it as a medical issue. And we need you to work with us to come up with the best way possible to treat drug addicted individuals. Put them in therapy. We have to have the doctors go in and exercise that classic patient-doctor relationship that is going to be so sacred in the years to come as we begin to treat drug addiction as a medical condition. And so we have skeptical doctors, but we need these doctors to step in and to help us with this drug issue, this drug epidemic in our country. So love to educate with you, love to work with you, give me what your concerns are. Let's move the ball forward. I think we'll be surprised, like Dr. Monahan surprised the heck out of me when he came in and told me I'm a cannabis advocate, and I thought for sure he was going to come in and teach me a few lessons about reality in a Republican area of the state.
Okay, Congressman Correa, it looks like we've run out of time here, but it's been a wonderful discussion. Thanks again so much for taking the time today. Really enjoyed the conversation. I hope everybody else did as well.
Paul, I just wanted to say to everybody, I conclude by saying, be strong advocates. Let's base public policy on facts and not politics. Thank you very much, and God bless everyone.